Hello and welcome to the Classical Next podcast, the global platform for the ideas and the people redefining classical and art music worldwide. I'm your host, David Taylor. Today, I'm talking with Simon Woods, President and CEO of the League of American Orchestras. As well as having a unique insight into the orchestral world from championing the League's members, which range from internationally famous orchestras to smaller community organisations, Simon also has an extensive knowledge of the classical music industry after working in the sector for 4 decades. He previously led the Los Angeles Philharmonic, Seattle Symphony, Royal Scottish National Orchestra and the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra, as well as being a record producer with EMI Classics. All of this experience makes Simon the perfect person to dive into the issues facing the orchestras and classical music industry today, both in North America and the rest of the world. In this conversation, we look ahead to the League of American Orchestras conference in Baltimore next week, and the discussions they will be having about how the funding and philanthropy landscape is changing in the face of the biggest transfer of generational wealth. We look at how orchestras can embrace uncertainty in an ever-changing world, how to address systemic resistance to change, and what inspiration international orchestras can take from American orchestras. Ultimately, Simon shares why the key navigation to these financial and cultural headwinds lie in empowering the next generation of audiences and leaders to help ideate the future of the art form. Right, that's enough from me. Let's jump in. Simon, it is great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's wonderful to join you. Good to see you again.
Definitely. Well, it is a very busy time for you as the League conference is, I guess, just over 2 weeks away, or around 2 weeks to today. So today we'd love to do a deep dive into both the orchestral world, both international and a focus on the US as well. But before doing that, I was really fascinated to hear more about the orchestral landscape in the US and also the League membership. I've been really surprised at the amount of orchestras that there are in America, as well as the variety in scales. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about the League's membership and the landscape in America.
Yeah, it's funny you ask that because whenever I go to speak to boards of orchestras, which I do quite a lot, that's one of the things that comes with my job running the National Association, I always use that data point. I always say, just want to let you know about the sheer size of the orchestra field in this country. You know, we have around 700 members, and there are members in, we have orchestras in all 50 states, including Hawaii and Alaska. They are in urban, suburban, rural communities. They are in coastal communities. They're in remote locations. It is a huge field. And at last count, the audience for American orchestras in an average year is around about 22 million people. So it's a huge field with a huge impact. And so, when people say, well, orchestras are dying or classical art forms are dying, well, it's really not true. There are plenty of challenges, don't get me wrong, but the field is big. It's deep in its impact, and it still is an art form that's beloved across the country. So that's something that I definitely enjoy about this field, the sheer amplitude of it.
Very much so, and it's great to see organisations as large as like the LA Philharmonic or the New York Philharmonic and things, all the way down to some orchestras that do 3 or 4 performances a year. And it's incredible that there's such a breadth that sort of encompasses what's going on over there.
Yeah, and actually, by the way, it's worth saying that when you look at the League's membership, when you look at our 700 members, they are the majority of them are small regional and local orchestras. So the brand names, if you like, the famous orchestras, let's say that the top 20 or so orchestras, they're only a small chunk. They're very prominent. They're globally famous. They have famous music directors and so on. Actually, the reality is that the vast majority of our membership is small and medium-sized orchestras who are doing sterling work in their communities, doing beautiful work and putting on amazing concerts. And the other thing that one of the great things about my job as I go around the country is I do have a chance to go not only to San Francisco or Chicago, but also go to smaller cities, and I'm always struck by how deep the quality is. I mean, you have to go pretty far down, like the list of orchestras by budget size, before you stop finding orchestras that can play a really great Rite of Spring or Mahler symphony, right? So the quality of American orchestras and the depth is really kind of astonishing.
It's really great to hear. Well, you mentioned that there are a number of challenges that are facing orchestras at the moment, and things we all have to navigate. With the conference coming up soon, what are the main challenges that you are tackling and looking at this year?
Well, look, I mean, the obvious one is the financial headwinds. I mean, we've got stuff hitting at us, in every direction, frankly, financially. We've got obviously huge inflationary pressure on expenses. We have big changes in ticket sales patterns, and what's interesting about ticket sales patterns is not so much that they are just changing, because they are changing, of course, changing generationally, changing post-COVID and so on, but also that they're unpredictable. I think everybody is struggling with the fact that in the old days, you could model a season based on your programming, and you wouldn't get it entirely right, but you'd have a pretty good shot at knowing what the audience was going to be like for every concert. I think that's getting more and more difficult. So there's a real unpredictability around ticket sales. And then, of course, the deep resource of all American nonprofits is philanthropy. And philanthropy is going through a complicated moment here because, there is something that is talked about just about everywhere, and it's a real common thread across all American nonprofits, is this massive generational transfer of wealth that's going on here. We have something like $15 trillion of wealth being transferred from baby boomer generation to the next generations over the course of a decade. And what's happening is that as wealth gets transited out of older generations who have a deep attachment to organizations and to the art forms that they love, to a new generation which doesn't have the same sort of, I would say, inherent kind of understanding of philanthropy that the predecessors had, and also has very different interests. I mean, this is, a generation that's much more focused on social justice, education, community aid, global aid. It's a very changed landscape for philanthropy. And then when you add that on top of that, changes in, the way foundations are allocating funds, challenges in the corporate market, the kind of bedrock of, the bedrock of funding for American orchestras. While, I don't want to paint an overly tragic picture. I mean, philanthropy in the US is still a remarkable thing. As a Brit being in the US, I never cease to wonder, when you look at the donor list for the New York Philharmonic or the Metropolitan Opera, I never cease to wonder at the like thousands of people who give every year. So it continues to be a wonder, right? But it's definitely changing. And that change in focus, that generational change in focus, I think is also part of what's forcing all arts organizations to have to think differently, to articulate their value, not only as arts organizations, but really how they make sort of civic and community impact. And that's something we probably want to talk about a bit more. So that's going on. And then you've got kind of, bigger environmental challenges as well that orchestras are dealing with, to do with the, very complex federal environment right now, to do with the global uncertainty and geopolitical unrest and the economy and so on. So right now, I think it feels difficult, I think, in American orchestras, and that's both at the very largest size and also in the smallest size. It's never been easy running an orchestra, but it definitely feels hard right now. And as I'm thinking about my remarks that I'm going to make at the conference in a couple of weeks' time, that's definitely at the top of my mind. And I still think we have a tremendous amount to celebrate as a field, actually. And and when we all come together at the conference, the sheer kind of energy and the collegiality and the sense of sharing that we have in this country is very precious to me. But it definitely feels hard right now.
Can certainly imagine. Just to continue your point of there's a lot to celebrate, I was really taken back with the reaction to the Timothy Chalamet comments about opera.
Yeah.
And not in terms of the reaction from the orchestral and classical music and opera community, but having voices in America from places that I wouldn't expect all of a sudden to
Yeah.
be involved. And you can see those connections, which I thought was really fascinating and really heartening.
Well, it was, and I mean, it just reminds us that you know, while the experience of classical music concerts is a very particular one. You know, we're very set in our rituals and the way a concert unfolds and what happens in the concert hall. The music speaks very broadly and continues to speak very broadly. And actually, when we're thinking about the next generation of audiences, we never have to forget that, certainly, even if I, speak to my kids who are in their mid to late 20s, on more than one occasions, they've said to me, yes, it's the music isn't the issue, it's the experience. And so I think that's a very big wake up call to us in this moment right now.
Very true. So to go back to what you're talking about, the financial issues, in particular around philanthropy, you were saying about there's now a transition to a new generation with different interests or levers on what they're going to give to. What trends are you now seeing, or is it a little bit too early to kind of say where they're going and how orchestras are able to react to some of those changes?
Well, look, I mean, I think that this is the changes that are happening now are not new, right? So American orchestras have always been deeply embedded in their cities. If my first job in the US back in the late 1990s was at the Philadelphia Orchestra, and remember going to the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1997. You could get into any taxi in Philadelphia, and the taxi driver, while they might not have known while they might not have ever set foot inside the Academy of Music, which was the concert hall that the Philadelphia Orchestra had then, nonetheless, they all knew that it was one of the really top things about the city. Um, and of course, there are other places like Cleveland and Chicago where that really is true. So the concept of orchestras being deeply embedded in their civic consciousness is nothing new. What I think the changes of COVID and this moment we're in now in terms of philanthropy have done is that they forced us to sharpen our pencils around that, right? So, and to sharpen our thinking about it. So, we really are in a moment where every orchestra is having to think about how it tells its story, how it tells its story about its impact, how it tells its story about how it affects communities. And how it tells its story about how it affects young people. So that is becoming, incredibly, incredibly central. And just this morning, actually, I received an email from the Montreal Symphony, actually, and always remind everybody, the League of American Orchestras, for North American orchestras, so not just US orchestras, Canadian orchestras are members too. And the Montreal Symphony just did an absolutely phenomenal community project, which extended to, they have a El Sistema-based program. They were doing, they had engagement with food drives. They had engagement with young people all across the city. The whole organization was involved in this kind of big week of community engagement and celebration. And when the email came through, I just thought, wow, that is so symbolic of the kind of really good work that's going on now as orchestras are thinking about that. And there are plenty of other examples. I mean, think about the Detroit Symphony, which, ever since Ann Parsons' time as the CEO of the Detroit Symphony in 20 years ago, she really transformed the Detroit Symphony into a kind of engine of civic revival, and the Detroit Symphony still thinks of itself in those terms today. So, I think that all of that work is there in orchestras, and it's perhaps in some ways even stronger in smaller orchestras. But it's definitely a moment when we're having to dial that up in our thinking. The story about we play, um, uh, you know, um, a narrow band of repertoire for a narrow band of people, that's just a story that simply is not gonna resonate in the future, which is not to in any way minimize the repertoire or the beauty of the repertoire, the impact of the repertoire. It's just that the story these days just has to be a lot bigger. Yeah.
Very much so, and it's really heartening to know that some of the answers to this challenge are already sort of in action, and we're getting to grips with it. And I guess as well that potentially this goes back to getting patrons in the 18th century, that actually you'd have to sell your story as to why you should have some sort of lord or count give money to your venture in that respect. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon, but it's new to sort of to revisit.
Well, and also I'll remind everybody, in if you're in a very big environment where you're heavily funded by government, as in continental Europe, or even, you know, by US terms in the UK, orchestras receive a, pretty, sizable chunk of their budget from government. You are held to account by government. Right? You are held to account in your funding contract with the Arts Council, with the Creative Scotland, or whichever body is funding you. You're held to account on certain things that you have to do as part of that. In the US, we don't have government funding, but we are in a sense held to account by our communities. And this notion of, our law in this country, the 501c3 designation, which is the federal law that designates charities. We talk about arts organizations being, we have this phrase being held in the public trust. And so what that means is that boards in this country are really the representatives of the community. The board's job is to hold the organization accountable to its mission on behalf of the community. And I think so. I think that these conversations about how we serve the community, are actually really nothing new. They're enshrined in law, but we're definitely having to think about them with new urgency.
That's really good to hear. And you mentioned about Central Europe and the UK. I've always been fascinated when I've been to America to see just how much of a well-oiled machine philanthropy is over there within departments and organizations. You're someone whose career has spanned multiple continents, so I'd love to hear your take on what you think other regions or territories might be able to learn from the US approach to philanthropy. Is there any sort of like
Well,
things you can see being done there that could be impacted here?
well, of course, it's the thing that everybody looks to the US for and wishes that they could import.
Apart from the donors themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, unfortunately, yes, exactly. Unfortunately, you can't import it because it's deeply, deeply embedded in the American consciousness, which is when you earn money, you give money. I mean, it is just, it's it, it's universal in this country. And so there's a sort of bedrock of understanding about that sense because here, social services and charities and the arts and museums and colleges and universities don't exist without philanthropy, right? So so it's just so incredibly central to the American view of the world, and what that means is that our development departments here are, even in relatively small organizations, are highly professionalized. I mean, it is an absolute skill set that's learnable, and it's extraordinary. I mean, you look at the development department of any big orchestra in this country is like 30 plus people. I mean, they're bigger than the staff size of the entire staff size of any British orchestra. And it's highly professionalized, highly skilled. It's all about building relationships, but there's also behind it a lot of science. There's a real danger in thinking that is instantly importable into other countries because the cultural base is just not the same, in Germany or France or even in the UK. But there are certainly things that one can learn, and I suppose in the end, ultimately, if there's one thing I'd say that's really important, it's about not being afraid to ask for money. And the best definition of philanthropy that I know is of a fundraising that I know is that you're connecting people with capacity to the chance to make a difference in organizations and causes they care about. And when you start reframing the work as helping people to make a difference in the world, it becomes very different than just the very transactional job of just going to them and say, would you give me $10,000? You know, so that reframing, I think, I suppose, ultimately is perhaps the biggest lesson of American philanthropy.
Really fascinating. And I love that with that, that's applicable to any organization of any size, anywhere,
Any
which
size,
is
any organization, anywhere in the world. I mean, yes. And by the way, you know, when we were at Classical Next in Budapest just now, this is the session that I was chairing, was about exactly this topic, actually, about the topic of what are the commonalities of communication across different countries. And here's the thing that's really interesting. You take a country like Germany, where it's all government funding, and you take a country like, the US, where it's all private philanthropy, and you take a country like England, where it's hybrid, right? It's a mixture of the two. The messages are basically the same. The messages are about impact, about how you make impact and how you make a difference to people's lives, about how you inspire people, about how you provide solace and joy and inspiration, and how you impact. The messages are not different. It's just having the kind of having a framework to articulate them in a way that's about impact, and that's not just about action. The idea of we play great music is not in itself an inspiring one. The idea of we inspire people and bring meaning to their lives is an inspiring one. So that kind of moving. I always say when we're talking about, I do quite a lot of teaching, and when we're talking about mission statements, I always say the most powerful thing you can do in a mission statement is move from talking about what you do to the change you make, and when you do that, it's really transformational about how you think and how you communicate.
very much so. And it's really heartening again to hear about commonalities. And so, speaking of commonalities, there's so much uncertainty in the world affecting people in the Americas, in Europe, in South America, Australia. How do orchestras embrace this sort of uncertainty going forwards?
Well, I think you have to lean into it. I don't think there's a choice. I mean, yeah, it's an incredibly uncertain world. And by the way, of course, this whole massive change out there around AI, and what are the implications of that for everything we do. I mean, it's profound, right? And there's huge uncertainty there, but I think you got to lean into it. I don't think there's another way. And if there's one thing that I think is challenging for all of us in the arts, in whatever country you're in, it's that we don't really have enough risk capital, because uncertainty requires that you have the capacity to innovate and experiment, because you don't know how, you can't respond to uncertainty except by trying things. There's no other answer. This is what I was saying earlier about audiences. If you can't predict audiences anymore, it makes your job of selling to them much more complicated, right? So so uncertainty demands risk. It demands experimentation. It demands having the willingness to fail, right? We don't have enough capacity in our budgets, in our human capacity, to to take as many risks as the uncertainty of the environment really requires us to. And I think that's a structural problem. And so I often say, when I'm talking to boards, it's like I often say, the biggest thing you can do as an organization is try to free up time, not just to be focusing about tomorrow, but to be focusing on what's happening in 10 years' time. And unfortunately, the nature of our business, and it's really sort of embedded in the nonprofit world in general, but the nature of nonprofits is that, you're always thinking in 3-year chunks, 3 to 5 year chunks. And we very rarely have the financial freedom to step out of that and say, let's make the changes which are going to affect the business in 20 years' time. And I think the moment we're in now, huge changes in philanthropy, huge generational changes in audiences. I think that moment demands of us that we think much harder about what we're doing today, which is sowing seeds for things that will happen in 20 years' time. But it's really hard. It's hard to find the bandwidth for that.
Like you say, it's not just financial, it's finding time, and when people are time poor a lot of the time, it's certainly a challenge. I think as well, I've not found an orchestral sector or region which hasn't struggled with, or isn't renowned for changing and innovating quickly. We are sort of systemically and culturally resistant to change at times. How do we sort of address this resistance?
Well, that's a $1,000,000 question. I mean, yeah, and you're absolutely right. And in some ways, I often look in this country to the smaller orchestras because the smaller orchestras tend to have much more flexibility than the really large orchestras. And it is this notion of kind of inflexible operating structures, stuck in planning cycles that are 2 to 3 years ahead. Um, it's very complicated, and it's worth saying that American orchestras are actually in many ways even more highly structured than British orchestras because we are really stuck in this idea that you have your 25-week subscription series, at least in the large orchestras. You have your 25-week subscription series, and every week follows the same pattern, and you do. And so innovating within that is really hard. So what I see often going on in American orchestras is I see a lot of innovation. There's a tremendous amount of innovation going on here around the core experiences. So different kinds of concerts, different kinds of community engagement, different kinds of experiences. But is the core concert experience, the thing that we do week in, week out, is not only the most difficult thing to innovate, it's actually probably the most important thing we need to innovate. And so one of the big unanswered questions for me is how if we want to kind of bring new generations of audiences in, and if we want to protect the art form for the long term, one of the big unanswered questions for me is how we are able to innovate at the core a little bit more than we're able to right now. And it's hard. Everybody's thinking about it, but it's hard.
Do you have any examples of people you see who are leading the way in that front, sort of who've either experimented or they're sort of doing things that you would see as a way forward for this?
I'm going to plead the fifth on that.
Very
Because
diplomatic.
because one of the great things about my job is that, we have orchestras like all over the country doing amazing work. So, I always try not to play the favorite children game. But I mean, I think it's on show every time we do a conference. That's part of what we do. And by the way, one of the things I really love about the field in the US is that we are very collaborative, and I think it's partly because there's almost no city in this country where there is steep competition among orchestras in the way that you would find, say, in London or Berlin or in Tokyo. We just don't really have that in any major American city. You might find an orchestra and a chamber orchestra and different orchestras doing different kinds of things, but we don't have that high level competition that exists in some other cities in the world. And I think that means that we're almost never in competition with each other. We're only in competition with ourselves. We're only in competition to think about how we can work better and more effectively and in a more in a more in a more impactful way. And so what that means is that this field in the US is really genuinely very collaborative, and people just don't have any hesitation to share their experiences, to share the things that they're working for them, and to share the things that aren't working for them. And that's something that I've always very much valued.
Very much so. Well, speaking of collaboration, one thing I've always been fascinated from being across this side of the Atlantic is looking to America and seeing things like orchestral shutdowns, which is quite a unique thing for us. But the thing that isn't unique is a potential us then dynamic between musicians and administration, which seems to be everywhere internationally. From your experience both in running orchestras and also from speaking to them now, what are some of the advice you can give for helping collaborate musicians and administrators for success going
Oh
forwards?
boy, that's such a complicated subject. It is continues to be the kind of most regrettable aspect of orchestral life, in most places. Yes, you read about the high profile flare-ups when things go badly wrong. those things we read about are not always the norm. And there are many orchestras, I think, which do think very seriously about culture. And actually, in our new strategic plan of the league, which we've just finalized, we've made organizational culture one of the pillars of how we're thinking about the future, because we recognize that it drives so much. You can, it's not exactly new in management theory, right? And it's been known for a very, very long time that that you can have the best strategy in the world, but if you have a poor culture, you will never be able to execute the strategy, right? So strategy and culture have to live together at the same level. And so building collaborative, inclusive, um, caring, um, thoughtful cultures is I've always thought that as a CEO, it's the thing you have to think about when you walk in the door of the organization every morning. And you should think about it on the same level as your financial outcomes and your mission outcomes. It just has to be writ large in how every organizational leader is thinking about their work. And the great thing about organizational culture is it costs nothing. It costs nothing to care for people, to value the individual, to build a culture where people have viewpoints that are, can express their viewpoints. It's the best return on investment that most leaders can ever find in their daily work. And it applies to the old kind of management musician board divide as well. I mean, I think that we have to continue to invite the musicians into our organizations as partners. I mean, these are the people these are artists. These are the people who are sitting on the stage. And, as somebody always said, audiences don't come to the concert hall to see managers manage or boards govern. And it doesn't mean that those functions are not important. They are, of course, vital, but ultimately, the people sitting on the stage are why we're here. And so having the artists involved in decision making, in discussions, in critical strategic thinking, I mean, it just strikes me as being just really not possible to do an effective job organizationally unless you are doing that. And I think many organizations now are thinking about that really hard, but we still have work to do there. And I think it's just incumbent on us to show that that is just a fundamental part of what it means to be a leader in an organization, is to value that human aspect of what we do at a very high level.
That's such good advice, and I love that sort of by including musicians in that process, there's an element of transparency about how the organizations run, so musicians then also understand some of the work of the administrators that may not be clear on things, and vice versa for administrators understanding musicians as well.
I mean, look, let's not be naive. It's not gonna suddenly mean that when you have difficult contract negotiations in a very difficult economic and budget time, they're not going to be extremely, like, you know, tough, rugged conversations. Of course they're going to be. But if you have the kind of that proximity effect of understanding and relationship, just gives it a different weight.
Very much so. Well, as we start to wrap up, I usually throw two quick questions at guests, but I'm going to add a third additional question for you today.
Go for it.
So the extra bonus question is, what are you most looking forward to with the league conference coming up?
Oh, for me, it's about the people. I just do genuinely. I mean, call me sentimental, but I just do genuinely love my colleagues across this field in this country. I mean, it's what, since I came to the US almost 30 years ago now, I mean, many of my friendships and professional friendships have been built here, and I love this field. I mean, it's just so full of incredibly great people, and that's the thing that for me, a lot. And I'm not the only person who thinks that, by the way. That's the thing that's so wonderful about conference. You walk in the door, and you can hardly walk across the lobby of the hotel without saying hello to and, greeting and shaking hands and hugging like, 8 different people. And that for me is what it's all, that's for me is what it's all about. It's ultimately a people business.
Very much so. And from seeing you at the Classical Next conference a few weeks ago, I couldn't agree more as well. So, into your slightly harder question, if you could change one thing in the classical music industry, what would it be and why?
Wow. I think I would say, I don't know that it's a change, but I would say valuing the past and the future on an equal footing. Because I hear a lot of I hear a lot of binary thinking about that. I hear a lot of binary thinking about how we've got to do things that are always new and always different and always appealing to a young audience. I believe all of that, but I also think it sits alongside legacy, and legacy is complicated today because there is a history of exclusion in classical music on many levels. But and we should and we are and we must go on continuing to think about that. But the fact is also we do have a very profound legacy. The repertoire that we look after and curate for future generations is still it's one of the most beautiful bodies of human creativity that we have, and we also have to treasure it. So for me, those I just don't want to hear. I just am very uncomfortable when I hear people going one or the other. We've got to be able to hold both of those things together. That's at the same time, that's for me the art.
Really good answer. And then finally, what do you see as the future of classical music? Where do you see hope?
I see hope in actually coming out to meet the next generation. I just think that is the big story, because it's the old rule about business, right? There's no worse business model than trying to get a larger share of a declining market. Think about it. And so I think that we have to structure our organizations so that we are oriented to thinking about this generation that is coming at us now, which is so different from previous generations, and to preparing ourselves for what the audience is going to be like in 20 years. And the good news is I think people are thinking about that. And it's not that uh they may not have the answers, but we're thinking about it. And one of the things I would say, and you asked, what gives me hope, is actually the people who have the answers are the people from that generation, right? And so one of the things that I think is also very important is that we invite the next generation into our discussions so that they can tell us, because they are the people who hold the answers, not us. So I think how we empower the next generation to help us ideate what the art form needs to look like for them is really important. Never losing sight of what we have, which is beautiful and valuable, but thinking about how we adapt it for the next generation. I have tremendous hope from that. At the League, we have a student leadership council, and we have a student constituency group which is growing all the time. I mean, it's something like 250 people now, and I have tremendous hope from that. And we're also celebrating this year 50 years of our youth orchestra division, which is just there are hundreds of youth orchestras across the US. So it's always a cliche to say, like, young people are the future, right? It just happens to be true.
I'd like to thank Simon Woods, President and CEO of the League of American Orchestras, for joining me, and thank you for listening. Before I go, Classical Next 2027 is heading to Katowice, Poland from the 8th to the 11th of May next year. It's that 1 week of the year where the whole industry actually gets together in one place, and I would love for you to join us. Registration is already open at classicalnext.com, and we'll be opening up the call for proposals soon. If you have any thoughts on today's episode, or if there's someone you think I should be talking to for the next show, you can find Classical Next on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, or just get in touch through the website. And finally, if you found the show useful, please do subscribe and share it with your colleagues. I'm David Taylor, and I'll see you next time.